title I've been deciding to address is the EU and the world, shrink or swim, and we'll see what it means concretely. It comes from many publications that I've been writing recently on how the EU is impacted by the global context, globalization, the economic crisis, etc., and also facing emerging powers, but also on the internal process of the EU, the new institutional means that it has at its disposal. Mainly it has a new diplomatic service, which is called the European External Action Service, which is supposed to provide more coherence, cohesion, continuity in the EU diplomacy, the EU foreign policy, the EU external actions. There is plenty of names to describe what the EU is trying to do abroad. My presentation is very Eurocentric, how the EU, as I said, is affected and how it can manage its loss of influence, let's put it bluntly. And I am more rather critical, I would say, in my presentation. So 20 years after the Treaty of Maastricht created a common foreign and security policy for the European Union, the question is whether the Europeans really understand the danger of marginalization they face on the international stage today. 20 years ago, so this Treaty of Maastricht, a major treaty for Europe, created what I will call the CFSP, this Common Foreign and Security Policy, based on the assumption that EU countries will progressively act as a bloc and speak with a common voice on the international stage. However, today, when looking at the material and institutional means put at the EU disposal, the CFSP looked toothless when faced with the challenges brought by globalization and multipolarity. We are constantly reminded of how out of touch Maastricht's initial aims were with the means the treaty deployed. Jacques Delors' warning in 1992, let's not talk of a single foreign policy, the objective is out of reach, but rather of the possibility of joint actions in foreign policy has become more relevant than ever. So today the CFSP looks toothless when faced with the difficulties of new rounds of enlargement and delays in developing alternative and complementary policies on the international stage. So first I will deal with the context and how it impacts, let's say, a shrinking EU. Then I will address, I will focus on the main priorities in terms of external foreign policy for the EU on which it should focus on. And finally, I will look at these institutional means that can help the EU to develop such a, let's say, strategic vision and action. So the euphoric period following the fall of the Soviet Union, when it seemed obvious that the world would westernize and politics would become more democratic and economies more liberal, is behind us. Dominated less and less by the West, multipolar but poorly regulated, more integrated but also more fragmented, destabilized by an international economic crisis and the resurgence of violence in places in Europe and the Middle East, such is the world facing the European Union. Globalization has created a new context in which the EU faces the risk of being economically weakened and politically sidelined. Europe is no longer a problem or a vital strategic focus for the rest of the world. Its assets, interests, and prospects have already been substantially affected. In late 2012, the verdict looks all the more harsh given that the emerging trends of the first decade of the 21st century, the rise of new powers, and the simultaneous decline of American capacity and influence under the strains of interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan, have been transformed by the financial crisis and the Western public debt concerns into a full-scale upheaval of the relationship between emerging countries and the West. It is already clear that this economic crisis will last longer for Westerners, even if it's not yet clear how much it will reduce Europe's international capacities and influence. However, as we will see, the EU has nevertheless been active abroad and developed a wide variety of external tools and policies outside the realm of this CFSP. The most notable successes are its trade and enlargement policies, and in some cases, the external dimension of internal policies, such as climate change. Moreover, the world taking shape in the second decade of the 21st century offers immense opportunities for the EU. Anyway, to limit this loss of influence, the EU needs to rethink its own role on the international stage. It must be more effective, concentrate on a small number of priorities, and make better use of the main institutional instruments at its disposal. So first, what to do? Concentrating on a small EU external policies. Global governance, enlargement, the neighborhood, energy and climate change, migration, and security and defense. Global governance. The EU is, above all, a unique model of regional integration with an integrated trade policy and an unparalleled internal market. It therefore has a major advantage in international trade negotiations, which should particularly allow it to introduce more conditionality in its bilateral relations. Using its internal market and its competition policy, the EU must maintain its world-class capacity to produce the standards and principles needed in the domain of international trade and competition. If used well, the Union's capacity as a standard setter can make it a leading actor in the creation of the new regulations which globalization makes necessary, an area where emerging economies remain hesitant and divided. In addition, Europe's policies and institutions are still a model of sovereignty sharing and economic solidarity between rich and poor. This model could prove useful inspiration for the new modes of international and regional governance made necessary by the political, economic, environmental, and other challenges and crises of the 21st century global order. The second point is EU enlargement. The European Union's enlargement strategy, which reached its pinnacle with the addition of 10 new member states in 2004, has been a formidable instrument of foreign policy in the EU's near neighborhood. It has allowed the EU to contribute to the political stability and economic development of its neighbors, particularly in Central Europe. It also led to the creation of an economic and political area comprising over some 500 million citizens, with all of the benefits that it entails in economic and diplomatic terms. So EU enlargement can still be beneficial and therefore should be pursued. A number of neighboring countries are still applying and aspire to join the EU. The strategy is probably not perfect, and it would be worthwhile tweaking it, particularly in terms of more stringent monitoring to ensure that countries joining the EU meet their membership requirements, and with Europe taking increased responsibility for instance, the victims of the relocations that their membership might entail. On this basis, the EU needs to offer the prospect of membership to those Western Balkan states that meet the preliminary conditions and make the progress required to them, of course, as was recently the case of Serbia. And the same applies to Iceland, which should not find it too difficult to join the EU. But the Europeans continue to be split over Turkey's future. Its calling to join the EU or not having a negative impact on people's overall perception of enlargement. Membership negotiations, which were decided and agreed by the EU member states, must now be pursued without prejudging their future developments, but only on a condition that Turkey makes progress in its reforms. The short-term challenge is to get Europe into Turkey, not the other way around. And lastly, enlargement must be viewed in the context of a global strategy encompassing all of the EU's neighbors, not all of which are inclined to join, of course. The important thing is to clarify their status in order to potentially identify the EU's new borders, let's say. The Arab Spring provides the EU with a historic opportunity to strengthen another pillar of its external action, namely its neighborhood policy, both to the south and to the east. So it's the third point, the EU neighborhood. The EU has to anchor its relations with its neighbors to a common foundation stone based on interdependence and shared values, and on shared values, if it is to promote prosperity and the rule of law all around it, and as such to build a veritable pole of influence regionally at the global level. Here, it would be absurd to return to the sterile debate over competition between South and East. The EU and its member states must show moral support and material aid to build prosperity and the rule of law through the entirety of the neighborhood. But in accordance with the principle of differentiation, the EU must grant additional benefits to those states that pledge to tackle their recurrent weaknesses: nepotism, corruption, the misappropriation of funds, and so forth. And it must adopt an intransigent stance with those that scorn basic rights, while making a particular effort to support civil society as a whole. The success of countries that can benefit from advanced status, such as Tunisia, Egypt, Ukraine, or Georgia, will act as a litmus test both for other countries in general and for the EU itself. The settlement of conflicts that threaten the security and the stability of whole regions, last year in Libya, this year in Syria, also demands strong involvement on the part of the EU. Both its diplomatic efforts combined with the use of sanctions should be pursued. This good neighborhood policy also concerns Turkey and Russia. This entails developing better relations with Turkey, independently from accession negotiations, by closely associating the country with this neighborhood policy and developing joint policies on a broad range of issues such as energy, security, migration, etc. It also means making progress towards a stable and constructive partnership with Russia, the great neighbor that cannot be ignored. The EU must move forward towards a stable and constructive partnership with Russia based on interdependence in such crucial spheres as energy, trade, free movement of people, but also on cooperation over major security issues on the EU's borders, with which the EU must move forward towards this. But also, such as the Caucasus, Syria, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and so forth, and beyond the EU's borders, such as Iran, of course, that we can discuss later on. The fourth point is the external energy policy. The future of its climate and energy policy represents a major long-term geopolitical, economic, environmental, and social challenge for the EU. Meanwhile, energy security remains a key challenge for Europe. Outside of Europe, the EU will face intensified international competition for increasingly rare and expensive fossil energy as a consequence from growing global consumption. This competition might have a strong impact on the European Union and its member states' ability to develop a comprehensive strategy for securing their energy supply. Moreover, political and physical threats to energy supply will persist in the medium term, posing serious threats to critical energy infrastructure of Europe. To meet the challenge of increasing dependence on foreign energy supplies, in 2030 it might be 95% for oil, 80% for gas. The EU must put solidarity at the heart of a new common energy policy. In this case, the EU should progressively act as a bloc with the ability to form energy deals with external suppliers. A comprehensive strategy of diversification should further re-equilibrate the EU supply from Russia towards Central Asia, which holds important gas reserves, and towards Mediterranean countries, which bear huge potential of electricity production. The EU and its member states also need to further cooperate and integrate through enhanced mechanisms for energy crisis prevention and management at the EU level. With regards to climate change, the international community has yet to develop a shared and fixed strategy for delivering strong climate mitigation action to date. Even though the direction of travel is relatively clear, that the world will embark on a transition of its production system towards a low-carbon economy, albeit at different speed of transition, the pace of change is important in determining the magnitude of climate management ahead for the EU and for the others. The European Union has so far, over the last few years, proven that it can be a driving force in the fight against global warming. However, it has lost its impact on climate negotiations since the Copenhagen failure in 2009. It must continue to engage with all countries, developed, emerging, and developing, to move towards the creation of a new and unavoidably complex institutional architecture that will accommodate the specific situation of each country. The involvement of developing countries is indeed a crucial factor for the project's success, but this can only be achieved if the efforts and financial commitments needed to meet the challenges are equally shared. The EU should support the work of governments, agencies, and research institutions in these emerging economies. In addition, Europe, and in many respects, a lot of these aspects also apply to the US, will only be credible if it acts to curb its own energy consumption. It must show the way by committing itself to energy efficiency, taking steps on the energy demand side, and making a commitment to develop and finance new green technologies. The fifth point is migration. It is also important to calmly, which was not the case over the last few months, and you've seen it recently in France with Sarkozy threatening the Schengen acquis. So to calmly discuss the issue of migration between European nations with aging populations and much younger foreign countries, whether they are neighbors or not. In the former, foreign labor is more of a solution than a problem. In the latter, while the majority of the population will find work at home, some people still wish to come to the EU. Upcoming discussions on harmonizing national asylum policies will be a first test in this area. And the last point is on security and defense, and here the conflict in Libya offers many lessons. It was a reminder on the need for more active engagement from all European countries, in particular Germany. It showed once again the importance of transatlantic cooperation, despite the stepped-back approach or lead from behind of the United States. And it confirmed the need for coherent and coordinated European military spending, particularly in the context of constrained public expenses. Let me now turn to, after having shaped this let's say, most critical elements of the EU foreign policy, how what is the need for adequate institutional means. The institutional means at the EU's disposal have been progressively upgraded with the successive treaty changes, from Amsterdam, which created the post of High Representative for CFSP with Javier Solana, to Lisbon, which finally set new tools intended to bring more coherence and effectiveness to EU foreign policies. The main innovation in the new institutional framework established by the Lisbon Treaty is the High Representative, who is Catherine Ashton, who assumes the functions of the former Commissioner for External Relations, as well as those of the rotating presidency, headed by the EU national countries themselves in the past, and the European External Action Service, which is headed by the High Representative. These innovations are useful additional tools, but they are just tools, and it will take time to bear fruit. To date, the process of negotiations, the internal process, complex, critical, very long, for these innovations has been long, laborious, and marked by many obstacles and rivalries between EU institutions themselves, as well as with member states. The High Representative and its diplomatic service are now effective since more than a year. So it is therefore timely to try a first preliminary assessment and evaluate how these innovations have been implemented and to what extent they have coped with the promise to make the EU a more effective and coherent actor abroad. On the one side, comments from the press, analysts, and even diplomats or EU officials have been rather critical, if not tainted by a certain disappointment. On the other side, the reaction from the EEAS, the European External Action Service, let's say the diplomatic service officials, is rather defensive, rightly claiming that it needs time, that it is a work in progress, and that the expectations are all too high compared with the means at their disposal. All this is true and is in a way repeating the never-ending story of the CFSP since its inception. More concretely, let us have a look at its tasks of coordination and coherence. It is fundamental for the EU to better coordinate and align its various external policies, be it trade, neighborhood, security, as well as the multiple external dimensions of its internal policies, such as climate, energy, research and development, migration, etc. These are two worlds for the European Union that have been completely divided and that needs to be bridged. So it is only by doing so that the EU will be able to address bridging these two worlds, complex and multifaceted challenges, such as building a prosperous and stable neighborhood, which cannot be limited to one of these external policies, but rather require a balanced combination of all of them. This coordination was done in the past within the European Commission by the Commissioner for External Relations. While this proved insufficient, there is no clear sign that there is better coordination today. Major external tools, such as trade, enlargement, or neighborhood, remain within the competence and administration of the European Commission, and therefore need to be bridged with the work of the diplomatic service. Coordination and coherence between the two pillars of the EU external action, the intergovernmental CFSP, and EU external policies based on what is called the community method, is also problematic. This is illustrated, for instance, with the EU action in the Middle East, where the European neighborhood policy is disconnected from the security and political issues, such as conflict resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. These are two realities that need to be addressed altogether. Last but not least, the High Representative, Catherine Ashton, was also tasked to ensure continuity of EU foreign policy. This is an opportunity for the High Representative to launch mid to long-term reflections on the future of EU foreign policy. However, it is still very much focused with current affairs and crisis without looking much at the future. In this debate, there are also positive developments that need to be built on. The continuity of EU foreign policy is now better ensured with the EU delegations abroad, which are, for the first time, real EU embassies abroad. The fact that these delegations are chaired by an EU ambassador representing the EU abroad permanently brings better visibility and coherence. It is also the EU head of delegation who chair the monthly meeting with all 27 national ambassadors and therefore sets the agenda. In all that, the EU is stronger, more visible and competent to address the issues at stake. Finally, in this period of fiscal austerity, the EU delegations abroad could also play a role in progressively pooling consular services of EU member states in certain countries. Building on this assessment, there are several ways to improve it in terms of enhanced coordination, better consistency, and continuity of external policies. 6 recommendations, concrete. A limited reallocation of resources within this diplomatic service. It is essential that any diplomatic service in the world is organized by regions and countries internally. However, this approach should be complemented by a limited reallocation of internal resources to cross-cutting issues, such as the role and support of civil society abroad in order to consolidate and support democracy, the rule of law, human rights, which remain crucial issues in many partner countries. The same could apply to energy, migration, global governance, etc. This would be a first step in ending with this disconnection between community and intergovernmental issues. Second is defining what is the EU interest. The High Representative, helped by the diplomatic service, needs to further reflect and make proposals in defining the EU interest, which is different from the addition of the interest of the 27 national member states. It has a responsibility to make proposals, launch reflections, and to put a framework, a timing, a goal, etc., for such a discussion to occur. This is particularly necessary regarding the future of EU strategic partnerships. The EU has so far 10 proclaimed strategic partnerships, but without real strategies. The third element is interinstitutional cooperation, and it works in all fields within the EU. All institutions, the EEAS, needs to work in close connection with the others. This role will be enhanced if it finds allies rather than competitors in other institutions, and not only in the Council. The fourth point is long-term assessment, something that the EU has been too poor so far, especially compared with the US. It is fundamental to develop an assessment of the long-term political and economic environment facing the EU over, let's say, the next 20 years, and identifying the main challenges which are likely to confront its institutions. An interesting project in this regard, which could be duplicated in the future, and which has been built in close cooperation with the National Intelligence Council of the United States, is the European Strategy and Policy Analysis System, which is based on an interinstitutional task force with representatives from the European Parliament, the Commission, the Council, and the Diplomatic Service. Then, to further deploy EU external representation abroad, some EU countries continue to challenge EU representation at the international level, insisting that the High Representative should represent only the EU and not its member states. So there are still in this area many open questions of allocation of competence that will need to be addressed. Finally, differentiated integration. And this is a concept which increasingly apply in many, many different fields within the European Union. And this can also apply in foreign policy. In certain cases, the High Representative should support or even propose further integration by only a few member states when necessary. In areas where differentiated progress is possible, in particularly in military matters, it is probably best either to pursue ad hoc cooperation or to use the tools of enhanced cooperation provided by the Lisbon Treaty. The fact that some ambitious member states take the lead in certain areas does not mean that these actions are not developed for the benefit of all the EU. At the end, the diplomatic service should not be designed and operate as an additional 28th diplomatic service. Given its limited means in terms of resources as well as competence, and the limited scope to see this enhanced in the short term, the diplomatic service should therefore rather be a symbol and vector for common action and concentrate on its tasks of coordination, coherence, continuity, and initiatives. In conclusion, if the EU is to develop a common foreign and security policy, 20 years after its creation, it needs more than ever to be able to count on convergence between the positions of its member states. In an increasingly shrinking Europe, it is essential to ask whether it is time to accept a fundamental truth that international strength comes only through union and that we need to think global and act European. At the end, this is simply what our partners are expecting from us. Above all, a more effective European external action is no longer a dream of European enthusiasts or federalists, but a necessary response to collective changes in the international system. The alternative is to try to swim alone in seas which have become too vast and turbulent for our individual states. And before going to the discussion, I would like to give some concluding remarks. On the transatlantic relations. The American University in Paris. We've been publishing a report 2 years ago, Reshaping EU-US Relations, a concept paper. It's a reflection group with former heads of states and heads of governments within the European Union. Mainly the message is that the Euro-American partnership remains strategic in all senses and a building block which is doubtless indispensable for the emergence of global solutions to global challenges. But it is no longer a sufficient condition given the new need to gain the participation and agreement of all major world powers. The West without the rest, to quote Samuel Huntington, can no longer make a difference, nor can it hope to find the solutions to globalization's challenges on its own. For the West to maintain a meaningful role and mission, it must be able to show that it has the power to involve other partners in the process of developing the new collective rules of the globalization game. So we have published this report, which calls on the European Union and the United States to adopt a common approach to managing globalization based on the following principles: supporting and practicing multilateralism, effective multilateralism, as the basis for international negotiations, actively promoting and endorsing shared sovereignty in the management of global issues, strengthening the Euro-American partnership as a platform for forging global partnerships with all the players on the international stage, rather than as a means of asserting Western leadership, foregoing in Europe the primacy of national sovereignty, and in the United States the claim to unilateral world leadership. Thank you very much.